Welcome to our webinar on ISDA documentation, focusing on the Euroclear and Clearstream collateral documents which are jointly published with ISDA. This is part of a series of webinars looking at recently published ISDA documentation that allows parties to comply with regulatory margin requirements. My name is Graham Bryant with ISDA. I'm joined today by Guy Antrobus, a partner in Allen & Overy's derivatives team, and Paul Lewis, a partner in Linklater's Derivatives and Structured Products Group. I'll hand over now to Guy to discuss the first slide.
Thanks, Graham. So this is the types of custodians slide. I'm just going to start off with a few words about the different types of custodians, since, as you'll see, that drives a lot of the documentation choices in IM. And there are different ways of classifying custodians. I think a useful one is, as you see on the slide here, bank custodian firstly, versus ICSD, or Central Securities Depository. Now, bank custodians are normally the custody arms of global financial institutions, and there's a small number of them in IM phases 1 to 3, but that number seems to be expanding greatly as we approach 4 and 5. And bank custodians can probably further usefully be broken down into tri-party and third-party, which is sometimes a confusing nomenclature. Tri-party, first of all, means that a lot of the collateral functions are automatically carried out by the custodian. The pledgor and the pledgee, and indeed the custodian, agree what collateral is eligible, and that will be in a trilateral eligible collateral schedule. And then the custodian moves eligible assets back and forth from the pledgor's account. And in addition to checking eligibility, the custodian values the collateral as well. So really, all the pledgor and pledgee need to do is to tell the custodian the target collateral value each day, and that will either be SIM or grid or a combination, and the custodian does the rest in the tri-party model. Now, this is different from third party, where the pledgor and the pledgee have a much greater role. They will need to manually tell the custodian what assets to put in the pledged account, and also which assets to remove, and therefore there is no eligible collateral schedule which involves the custodian. And it's also the case that one of them will have to work out the value of the collateral too, since the custodian is not doing that in the third-party model. Now, in this webinar, we're obviously talking about Euroclear and Clearstream rather than bank custodians. And as I said, these are central securities depositories, so they are different from bank custodians. Now, they obviously have a broader role in the settlement of securities, that is, as ultimate holders of securities so that people can hold and transfer them in book entry form through intermediaries. But in addition to that sort of fundamental function, these houses also have an important role as a custodian in this context, which is to say that participants transfer their securities to pledged accounts in Euroclear or Clearstream as applicable in order to grant security over them to satisfy their UMR obligations. And the final introductory remark actually I would make is that both Euroclear and Clearstream are tri-party agents, so not third-party. So they will, as I said before, automatically value the collateral and they will allocate the securities back and forth. So the documentation suite that you'll need for IM broadly breaks down into two categories. Firstly, the bilateral documents, and secondly, the custodial documents. So taking the bilateral documents first, the bilateral documents are between the pledgor and the pledgee, and they're published by ISDA and therefore covered by the standard ISDA collateral giver and taker opinions. Now you can see from this slide, there are broadly 5 kind of packages of bilateral documents, and they're largely driven by your choice of custodian and where that custodian is located. Now, there are separate webinars on the first 3 packages here. So that's the IM CSA, the New York document, the English CSD, the bank CTA and associated pledges. But what we're interested in here is the last 2 on this slide in bold, i.e. the Euroclear CTA plus the Belgian pledge and the Clearstream CTA plus the Luxembourg pledge. Now, Paul will shortly get into the detail of these in the next slide, including how they've evolved over time, because by now there are actually numerous vintages of each. But one key structural point I would note in passing, if you're familiar with an IM CSA or CSD, is that the CTA and pledge, you can effectively think of them as a CSA or a CSD chopped in 2. And the first part of that, if you like, is the CTA, where all of the delivery and quantum provisions are housed. So things around delivery amount, return amount, those provisions are all in the CTA, and that CTA will match the governing law of your ISDA. Whereas in your pledge, that will contain the provisions around the grant of security and the enforcement mechanics. And those, as I say, go in the local law pledge. So that would be Belgium for Euroclear and Lux for Clearstream. And that's so that these kind of proprietary aspects are governed by the same law as the location of the assets. Okay, so that's the bilateral documents published by ISDA. And then just to note, finally, in passing, there will be trilateral custody level docs in place between the pledgor, the pledgee, and the custodian. And these, in essence, tend to establish control over the pledged account, i.e., when will the custodian allow the pledgee to access the collateral on a default, for example. And those documents differ custodian to custodian, so they are not published by ISDA. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Paul now to take the next slide.
Thanks very much, Guy. So Guy's given an overview of the documentation, and in particular this fact that for the ICSDs, the bilateral documents are bifurcated into the CTA, which deals with the contractual mechanics of the initial margin posting, and then the security agreement, which creates the security interest over that initial margin. And a point worth noting is that the CTAs are drafted as two-way margining documents. That is, both parties can be the provider of collateral, but they're often used one way, where parties have chosen to use different custodians. By contrast, the security agreement is one way. So even if both parties use the same custodian, for example, the same ICSD, there would still need to be two security agreements. So let me now look a little bit in more detail at exactly which documentation is available. So the Euroclear Clearstream documentation was first developed in 2016 for what was known as phase one of the implementation of the IM rules. And there have been various iterations and additions to that document set since 2016, culminating in the so-called next generation documents, or next gen docs, which were published in early 2019. So starting with the phase one documents and taking Clearstream first. For Clearstream, there are two 2016 forms of CTA. One is governed by English law, and the other form is governed by New York law. And the idea here was that parties would match that governing law to the governing law of their ISDA master agreement. There was also a 2016 form of security agreement, and as Guy has already mentioned, the security agreement for Clearstream is governed by Luxembourg law, as that's the jurisdiction of Clearstream, and where the relevant secured account is maintained. Now, for Clearstream, the 2016 forms assumed that the secured account would be held with Clearstream in the name of the security provider. And that led to some future developments because due to Japanese law requirements, where Japanese securities are to be posted, there's a requirement that the secured account should really be in the name of the security taker. And as a result, the 2017 version of the Clearstream security agreement was published, which is to be used where the secured account is to be in the name of the security taker. So it's published in order to facilitate this Japanese securities posting. In addition, at the same time, not on the slide, there were two additional sets of amendment provisions which were published to be used with Japanese collateral. So that's the initial set of Clearstream documents. So on the Euroclear side, it's very similar. In 2016, there were also two forms of CTA, again, one governed by English law and one by New York law. And there was a 2016 form of security agreement, and this time governed by Belgian law because Euroclear is Belgian and the secured account is maintained there. It's worth noting, though, for Euroclear, the secured account is in Euroclear's name for the account of the pledgee. And that difference with Clearstream means that the Clearstream and Euroclear documents, whilst very similar, have evolved over time with a few differences. So for Euroclear, in 2017, there was a further CTA that was published, and that was to reflect a change in the way that Euroclear dealt with the release of income that was credited to the secured account, and no new security agreement was published at that time. And then in 2018, there was an additional set for Euroclear of a CTA and a security agreement that were republished to reflect necessary changes for use with Euroclear's multi-seg service. And that service means that each pledgee has one account which holds pledged assets in legally segregated, unique subdivisions of the pledged account, reflecting each pledgor. The feature wasn't operational immediately at the point those documents were published, and so the drafting envisaged that they could be used either with the traditional single special seg account structure or with this new multi-seg account structure. So in addition to those bilateral documents, as Guy has mentioned in the previous slide, there's a range of additional documentation that's required with the ICSDs themselves, and membership documentation. And the slide highlights the main documentation by title, but for purposes of this webinar, I'm just going to draw out a few key points that relate to them. So the membership documentation can be seen as being similar to the account control agreement, or ACA, in the bank custodian context. Governs the relationship with the custodian, the ICSDs, and deals with a variety of matters, including how instructions are given, how distributions and voting rights work, and so on. Importantly, these docs are non-negotiable. They represent the standard terms of each ICSD. They're governed by the laws of the jurisdiction of that ICSD. And related to the previous point Guy made, which is that the ICSDs have a much wider service base of products than just custodians. Lots of parties already have existing relationships with the ICSDs, and so using it for IM could just be an additional piece tacked onto that. So in many cases, the documentation is already in place with ICSDs. As an aside, it's worth noting there are various representative structures where it might be a representative of the party who has a relationship with the ICSD rather than the party itself, but that gets a little bit complicated, and we're not going to cover that in this webinar. And then finally, on the membership docs, it's worth noting that in 2016, both ICSDs made certain changes to their membership docs in order to align with this development of the IM documentation and the required mechanics for those. So that's the historical position. And then to bring right up to date, the next-gen docs. So in early 2019, next-gen versions of the ICSD bilateral documentation were published. And as we shall see, these largely reflected changes that have been made to the bank custodian bilateral documents at the back of 2018. So for Clearstream, the 2019 CTA was published together with two forms of security agreement, one for where the secured account is in the name of the security provider, and one for where the secured account is in the name of the security taker. And then for Euroclear, a 2019 CTA was published together with a 2019 form of security agreement. You can see from this slide there's a very large range of potential documentation that might be used, and notwithstanding the 2019 versions of the CTA and security agreement, it's still possible that a number of market participants might use the older forms, especially when those participants were caught in the earlier phases and had built their systems and processes to align with those older forms. It's useful, therefore, to have this understanding of all the different documentation that's available. And with that, I think, Guy, I'll hand back to you for the next slide.
Thanks, Paul. So this next slide is just a hopefully helpful way of kind of visualizing what Paul has just been describing. So if we ignore for now the next-gen boxes along the bottom of this slide and just concentrate on the boxes above, which represent the phase 1 documents. If you're using a phase 1 set of documents and you have an English ISDA, then if you kind of look at the left-hand tree on this slide, as it were, with Euroclear, what you would have is an English law Euroclear CTA, a Belgian law pledge, and a Euroclear form of trilateral collateral schedule, i.e. between pledgor or pledgee and Euroclear. And then in that same fact pattern of an English law ISDA, if you were using Clearstream with the phase 1 docs, if you move slightly to the right, you can see it's basically the same. It would be an English Clearstream CTA, a Luxembourg pledge this time, and Clearstream's form of eligible collateral schedule. And then if you jump to the right-hand side, that shows what you would do if you had a New York ISDA. And the only difference from what I've just said is that the CTAs you would use would be New York law governed to match your ISDA rather than English law governed. Now, as Paul said, next gen is slightly different, and that's represented by the boxes at the bottom. And people will be aware that ISDA has published French and Irish law ISDA master agreements now. So in theory, your ISDA could now be one of English, New York, Irish, or French law governed. So the next-gen Euroclear and Clearstream CTAs have a toggle now for the election of the governing law. It's the same form of document, and you just elect via paragraph 13. So this means that whatever law your ISDA is, you will use the same form of Euroclear Next-Gen CTA or Clearstream Next-Gen CTA and just make an election. And like before, you would pair these with a Belgian pledge for Euroclear, the so-called Next-Gen Belgian pledge, or a Lux pledge for Clearstream, the so-called Next-Gen Lux pledge. And with that, I will hand back to Paul.
Thanks, Guy. So on the next slide, we'll just take a very quick look at what's different in the ICSD Next-Gen document. But before that, just to draw out a few points of difference between the ICSD documentation, the CTAs and the SAs, and the bank custodian documentation that is just useful to be aware of. So the first is, because both ICSDs are tri-party, this means that they will always be the ones who value the collateral in the secured account. So as a result, the CTAs have this specific concept of collateral valuation agent, which is assumed to be Clearstream or Euroclear. That's not subject to dispute provisions in the way that other calculations, for example, in the SIM calculation of required IM, are. And the next point is perhaps more of a draftsperson point, but just to be aware of, is that different terminology is used in the CTA and SA than in the bank custodian CSAs and CSDs. So in most cases, there's a fairly clear equivalence between the terms, but for the first time reading, you just need to be aware that concepts in the bank custodian documents may be called something different in the CTAs and the SAs. Turning then to the next-gen documents, what's changing those? So as we've seen in the earlier webinars, the next-gen bank custodian documentation has contained changes that reflect input from the broader industry working group for the next-gen documentation. And one notable change with those was the addition of 3 options to specify how regulatory required IM is to interact with non-reg independent amounts that the parties may have agreed to post to each other, but with at least the required amount of reg IM needing to be posted on regulation compliant terms. In addition, on the bank custodian side, the opportunity was taken to learn from phases 1 to 3 by removing some little used options and including some wording that had become common in the negotiated forms of those documents. And it's really those changes to the bank custodian documentation that have substantively been reflected and lifted across into the ICSD documentation, albeit that because they come from a slightly different place, such changes might not always be word for word. But substantively, they should get you to the same place. And then just to pick out a few points to finish on, in the bank custodian next-gen documentation, there were changes to reflect the assumption that with the now wider sort of group of people who are caught, the assumption that one of the parties might not be able to actually run the SIM model for IM themselves. And that led to the introduction of a calculation agent concept, as opposed to previously where both parties had to calculate the required amount of IM. And the 2019 CTAs follow this approach by introducing the concept of a calculation agent IM as an alternative from each party calculating the credit support amount. One party can be the calculation IM and calculate. As Guy mentioned, the governing law provisions have been amended, so rather than have the separate forms of New York and English law CTA, we now have one form, but that has this toggle that allows you to match your governing law to that of your master agreement. And then finally, there's some adjustments made to the definition of notification time, so the time to notify Clearstream or Euroclear of any changes to the credit support amount can be extended to the latest time by which that ICSD accepts instruction for same-day transfer. And that was another change that reflected wording that had been commonly introduced into the negotiated documents for phases 1 to 3. And I think with that concludes the summary of the changes.
So that brings us to the end of our webinar today. I'd like to thank our contributors, Paul Lewis and Guy Antrobus. If you have any questions on this webinar or any of our other webinars, please contact us at ISDALegal@isda.org. Thank you for listening.